If members, if in the audience, if you'll stand before I gavel in, we're going to have prayer led by Senator John Payton and ask him to remember our friend and colleague, Senator Stubblefield's family. Senator Payton, you are recognized.
Bow with me, please. Our Father in heaven, God, we love you and we thank you for this day. You're an awesome God, and you've definitely prepared the way before us for many generations. And Lord, we just pray that you'd help us in this gathering, Lord, to look for your guidance and your wisdom. Lord, we think of our brother Gary Stubblefield and his family. Lord, it seems like a very inconvenient time for his leaving, but God, your timing is perfect. May we understand that what we do here today doesn't just impact those that are here today, but those that will be coming in the future, as we'll all have an appointment like Gary to be called home. Lord, just pray that you give us your wisdom and guidance so that we make wise decisions. Lord, I pray that you give us an attitude of harmony so that we can subdue our passions and address the things before us, Lord. And pray once again for Gary's family, which by extension includes so many here. Lord, forgive us where we failed you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Call to order the Joint Performance Review Committee. Appreciate everyone being here today. Each and everyone welcome. I would ask that we hold talking comments down where everyone be able to hear. Our first order of business is to approve the minutes from the October 21st, 24 meeting. I'd take a motion. Motion. Have a motion and a second. All in favor, aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. Next, we have consideration of the motion to authorize the chairs to approve special expenses incurred by the JPR committee. I'd take a motion. Have a motion. Have a second. Second. All in favor, aye. Opposed? That motion is approved. Our reason for our meeting today, we have a discussion on citizens' complaint regarding Franklin County prison proposal. I would just ask the presenters to come up. We are going to swear in all of our presenters today. That's something not all committees can do. We do have that, so if you'll come stand at the committee and I'll read you your oath. Just go ahead and get in front of your chair there and hit your microphone, please. If you will, state your your name and your position or employer.
Adam Watson, I'm a director with Gravel and Grit.
Natalie Cadena, Executive Director of Gravel and Grit.
Okay, if you will raise your right hand, and do you solemnly swear to affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Acknowledge both of you. Please have your seat. Again, thank you for being here today, and at this time we're going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Good afternoon, chairs and committee. My name is Adam Watson, as I said. My colleague here is Natalie Cadena. Before we get started, I want to take just a minute to thank the chairs, the vice chairs, for agreeing to set this hearing and reviewing our complaint, and to thank all the committee members present for taking the time to be here and hear us out. Ever since the governor announced the Franklin County site almost a year ago, we've consistently heard from lawmakers and state officials that citizens would have ample opportunity to be heard on this matter, and unfortunately it just hasn't proven to be the case. So we're extremely grateful for both your time and attention here today. It's also especially timely that we're here today in the wake of Senator Stubblefield's passing, and we're honored to be able to continue the conversation about an issue that was so vitally important to him. So our thoughts are certainly with his family and his district as they grieve his loss and celebrate his life. Turning to our complaint, in addition to the complaint itself, we've provided the committee with an exhibit list, a timeline, 141 exhibits, and a presentation that will be on all of your screens. And we'll talk through that presentation as we present our evidence. Since this is all pretty dense and voluminous, I want to go through just a couple housekeeping items so we're all on the same page before we dive into the complaint itself.
If you will, slide, you're doing good, but slide that mic just a little bit
Certainly.
closer to you.
Is that better? First, we've been cautioned on more than one occasion, which I think is exceedingly fair, to be exceptionally careful about the veracity of what we present to lawmakers anytime we have the chance to speak with you. So the way we decided to present our complaint is in the style of a summary judgment motion. Now, kind of surprisingly, to me at least, I only count 3 attorneys on this committee. So for those who aren't familiar, what I mean by that is we don't intend to make any factual statements to you today that aren't supported by evidence. So whether it's documentary evidence, prior testimony, photographs, news reports, etc., everything we share with you will be verifiable. Some of it's going to be quick as we try and keep up with the presentation, but assuming all this technology cooperates with us, the evidence supporting each statement we make will be displayed on the screens as we talk. If you're viewing each of those pieces of evidence will be labeled with an exhibit number on the screen, and that exhibit number corresponds to the list we provided you. If you're viewing that electronically, each line item contains a link to the reference source material, so it's easy to review. And what's looping on the screen now is an example of how to access that. But we're more than happy to stick around if there are any technical issues. And a quick note on technical issues, a couple of our videos are freezing up, but the audio is fine, so it's not you if something looks frozen. Second, we want to address what we expect of the committee, given its legislative purpose and limitations. We fully understand that this committee is not a police force-style investigative unit that has either the leeway or the resources to launch a full-scale, quote-unquote, investigation into the matters we've complained about. We filed this complaint because over the course of our research and investigation into the matters we're complaining about, we've been able to piece together facts that tell a story that indicates what we believe to be the extreme likelihood of impropriety and malfeasance in a number of instances. But the tools available to us as private citizens are limited by the FOIA, lack of subpoena power, and the general ease with which state officials can avoid us. So while we can tell you a good deal of the story here, there are holes that we just can't fill in on our own. And that's where we're asking the committee to come in. We strongly believe that what we know plainly constitutes smoke, and we're asking the committee to determine whether or not there are associated fires. Lastly, we hope to keep our presentation to around an hour, including the time I've already taken. But complaint 4 will be about as long as complaints 1 through 3 combined, and it's very dense. So if the committee would like to take a break at any time, that would be about the halfway mark for us, and we'll remind the chairs when we get to that point. We see today as the first step of uncovering the truth in this matter. So depending on what you think about what you hear from us and the answers you get from the state officials in attendance, we'd strongly encourage you not to consider this a closed matter after today's hearing. Whether you decide that further hearings are necessary, that referrals to other investigative bodies or interim studies are appropriate, that legislative audit needs to get involved, or if you simply have additional questions or curiosities, we want you to know that the line of communication both to us and to our officials in Franklin County is always open. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to get started on complaint 1, and then we'll go back and forth between the two of us as we progress through.
Good morning, and thank you for being here to listen to our.
If you will,
complaint
pull
today.
your mic down
yep,
and
I
pull it
gotcha.
a little closer to you.
How's that?
That's good, thank
Okay.
you.
Good morning, and thank you for having us today. So our first complaint is that it reads that it is improper for Arkansas taxpayers to be burdened with supporting the salary of 2 leaders of the Department of Corrections. On January 10th, 2024, the Board of Corrections voted 5-2 to fire Corrections Secretary Joe Porfiry via special teleconferencing meeting. Governor Sanders immediately rehired him as her senior advisor, then appointed Lindsey Wallace as the replacement Secretary of Corrections a few weeks later. Taxpayers fund both salaries, so roughly $190,000 for both a year, And the media has well covered that there is no apparent role that Mr. Porphyry serves within the governor's office. However, documentation from the governor's office lists his role as the public affairs director. Now, by all appearances, it seems Mr. Porphyry's role hasn't changed one bit since his dismissal and immediate rehiring. Internal emails reflect that months later, agency heads still defer to Mr. Porphyry's leadership for matters involving corrections. Mr. Porphyry still testifies on behalf of the Department of Corrections, standing in for Secretary Wallace when she's unable to answer questions regarding the new prison.
So why could they answer the questions on Monday, but they couldn't on Thursday?
Representative Wooten, I wish I had a good answer for you with regards to what your questions may have been to Secretary Wallace and her ability to answer those questions. I don't.
Stephen Vanier, the consultant allegedly running this project, addresses deliverables to the attention of Joe Porphyry. In the prior committee hearing days earlier, when Secretary Wallace was still trusted to represent the DOC, she repeatedly responded with some form of "I don't know" to committee members. Questions at a theme in her testimony that we, and apparently some legislators, have noticed all too frequently for a department head.
I don't have the answer. I can't tell you the specific checks. I don't know the answer to that. And I just can't answer the question about how much the overall cost is going to be at this point in time.
What
We
we
also-
have here is a conundrum.
Oh,
We
sorry.
don't know, you don't know, and apparently the governor doesn't know.
So, what are we on, Exhibit Q? I'm losing my place here. Okay, there we go. Thank you. We also think it's noteworthy that Secretary Wallace isn't even on this hearing's agenda to represent the DOC. Now, as to Mr. Porphyry's qualifications for either a department head or some kind of senior advisory role to the governor brought Mr. Porphyry to Arkansas out of a tumultuous run as the deputy director of Arizona's Department of Corrections. He was passed up for the directorship after playing or failing to play a role in events such as known but ignored prison lock malfunction, leading to attacks on guards and inmates, a severely lackluster attempt at managing the COVID situation in Arizona's prison system, and a botched software rollout so full of bugs that it led to hundreds of inmates being locked up beyond their release date, which is eerily similar to the system problems at issue in Grant Hardin's misclassification and recent escape from Calico Rock's North Central Unit. Mr. Porphyry's personal friendships have also caused us to examine potential violations of Arkansas procurement law. On May 16th of 2024, Vanier's Executive Director of Justice emailed Director Laidlaw, Mr. Porphyry, and several others about how excited Vanier was to work with the state and marking the beginning of a mutually beneficial relationship. The only problem here is that this is over a month prior to the state issuing the RFQ, which Vanier ultimately won. Vanier was introduced to state officials by Matt Cate, the former head of California's corrections agency and current consultant of whom Vanier is a client. He reached out for an informal discussion despite the political hurdles that needed to be overcome before formal planning could get started. I guess it's who you know, not what you know, and apparently he's an old pal of Mr. Porphyry. This is one of those instances where we clearly see smoke, but since Mr. Porphyry has been elevated to the governor's staff, FOIA is no longer an effective tool for us, so we can't investigate without further assistance. Now, since he appears to still helm the ship, we thought it prudent to review his prison construction experience. When asked about his experience bringing in prison projects under budget, Mr. Porphyry responded as follows.
And a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Porphyry, you said you built 3 prisons under budget or within the budget that was given to you.
That's correct, sir.
What year was that?
So the last prison that we built was in 2008.
Now, we're fine admitting that we aren't prison construction or construction budget management experts. but it doesn't appear that a criminal investigations manager, supervisor, special investigator, or correctional officer has anything to do with those responsibilities either, as evidenced by Mr. Porfiry's resume. So while his resume may reflect experience in monitoring prison systems, it does not reflect even a modicum of experience designing, planning, or constructing prisons. Notably, neither does the flowery biography included with his appointment announcement. What we think is clear here is that we have an acting Secretary of Corrections who is plainly incapable of fulfilling the role, and a fired Secretary of Corrections who's still doing the job, but with a reputation so bad from his previous job that Carlos Garcia, a 20-plus year corrections professional, said, "Joe was doing crazy things and allowing crazy things to go on. He's going to go to Arkansas and do the same thing. It was the same garbage you guys are going to experience." Further, in his de facto role and continued adversarial relationship with the Board of Corrections is exacerbating an already flawed secretive process that has led us here today. So who's really running the show? Is it the alleged senior advisor with a bad rap, the stand-in secretary, the embattled Board of Corrections, or the high-dollar California contractor who points the finger back at the Department of Corrections leadership while taxpayers foot their bills for booze and first-class travel? Arkansas taxpayers are funding this incompetence, inefficiency, and potential illegality at a total clip of $377,000 a year, with no clear leadership of a corrections department trying and failing to undertake the second most costly capital improvement project in the state's history. While we have a full appreciation for the governor's purview to appoint her own staff, this is clearly a trampling of the Board of Corrections' oversight authority and a misuse of taxpayer funds. In addition to the list I handed out to you, or you have, there are some questions that we think are raised by complaint 1. You need to read those or just let them go? Okay. Are you going to click your way through?
Yeah, just catch me if I miss. Based on complaint number 2 is it's an improper use of taxpayer funds to pay a consultant for a task while simultaneously having an unqualified state agency perform the same task. Based on Mr. Porfiry's ALC testimony from November of 2023 that you're about to hear, the site selection process for a carceral facility in the state began in earnest of late fall of 2023. You'll also hear him note that the vendor selected is responsible for both selecting the site and ensuring community buy-in.
That the vendor who proposes to build the facility will have to inform us of the location and community buy-in with regards to where the prison will be located. That process is underway. We're hoping to issue an RFP sometime in the beginning of the new year.
Over the next several months, rather than a vendor, officials from TSS, which is another acronym now, apologies for not updating that, in conjunction with DOC officials and governor's office staff, worked to narrow down sites across the state that fit parameters, however fuzzy, developed by DOC. On July 3rd, 2024, an intern with GIS found an online listing for the property located at 6310 Arkansas 215 in Charleston. That site was put under contract at the end of July of 2024. Simultaneously with the site selection process that was being undertaken by state agencies, on June 25th, 2024, DOC issued an RFQ for owner's representative services for this project. That RFQ specifically referenced the need for the owner's representative to, quote, assist in the project site selection. These services are also contemplated in the contract between Veneer and DOC. However, well in advance of the contract even being finalized, site selection had already been completed, however inadequately, by state agencies with no specialized construction, workforce, or prison experience. On July 22nd, 2024, 3 full months before Veneer's contract's execution, GIS Director Shelby Johnson emailed his colleagues stating, "Prison site selection done." And as you saw a moment ago, the property was under contract just 3 days later. It wasn't until October 14th, 2024 that AOC even reviewed the contract. And in response to citing questions at that meeting, Director Laidlaw made false assertions to the committee, both that the site had not yet been selected and that Veneer would be assisting in that site selection.
Good morning. I'm just curious, where is this proposed facility going to be built?
We have not selected a site yet, so we're still working on that. In fact, the owner's representative will help us with finalizing our options for the best site that's most suitable for the facility.
Can you tell us any place all over the state of Arkansas? Is it any particular area of the state?
We have looked at many, many sites. We're working with criteria for the facility, which involves workforce numbers, access to emergency services, infrastructure. There's quite a bit of criteria. Workforce is a heavily driving criteria for the site as well.
So I guess I'm still trying to see where it's limited to. So could that be all over the state? Could be anywhere in the state, or do you know some defining it?
We've looked at sites all over the state. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thank you, Representative.
The state closed on the Franklin County property 3 weeks after that testimony. To summarize, that's 22 days from finding the listing to site selection done and under contract, 3 months prior to contracting with the firm intended to handle site selection. There were multiple other sites considered for this project, but unlike those sites, the state did not put the Franklin County site under an option contract. In fact, they had instructed their broker to put a Fort Smith property under an option just 7 days prior to locating the Franklin County listing. For the Franklin County site, they didn't use a broker and simply entered into a regular purchase agreement. Thus, not only did the state agency failures by both GIS and DBA result in selection of an unfeasible property for the project, the improper contracting mechanism negates the state's reasoning for intentionally hiding the site selection from the public. In other words, there was no danger of a bidding war breaking out for a property under a purchase contract.
In regards to the who knew what and when, ultimately it was important for the taxpayers with regards to ensuring that there wasn't an escalation in the price and a bidding war to keep it quiet. The price of this property was the property under consideration.
Yeah, the community wasn't buying it that night either. Considering the timing of the owner's representative contract and the state's subsequent closing on the Franklin County property, coupled with Director Johnson's email regarding the finality of site selection months prior, it's plainly impossible that Veneer could have legally participated in any meaningful manner in the site selection process. This means that taxpayers have paid in duplicate for both Veneer services, which it could never have legally performed, and the salaries of a litany of top-level state agency staff for the months of time working through the site selection process. More importantly, by failing to let experts conduct this critical piece of research geared toward finding a property that is actually feasible for this type of facility, the state finds itself here today, 5 failed votes short of funding, and all but begging for a design contract that has already slashed criteria to cut unnecessarily bloated costs rather than a design based on the state's needs, and at serious odds with the very community which it will desperately need to patrol these cells. These substantial oversights have undoubtedly cost taxpayers far more than just duplicate payments, and the state is left having purchased a property that is plainly not suitable for the facility it intends to build. Here are a couple of the questions that we think are relevant to this section while Natalie gets ready for section 3.
So in complaint 3, we ask, is expending taxpayer funds on a capital project without funding for such a project is an irresponsible and improper? As we sit here today, the state has either spent, committed to spend, or is on the cusp of asking the legislature to approve the spending of tens of millions of dollars on a project for which the legislature has repeatedly refused to even create an appropriation. Now, to dispel some misinformation that was going around after session, the legislature did not approve $75 million specifically for this project, a project which had not yet even been thought up when the legislature appropriated that $75 million in connection with a 498-bed expansion of Calico Rock's North Central Unit. Notably, that appropriation was specifically for prison expansion, not new prison construction. Semantics, I guess. We note this for two reasons. One is to dispel any information indicating that there was even tacit approval for the current project by the current legislature. And second, to note that those figures place the cost of that expansion at about $150,000 a bed, while the math on 3,000 beds at $825 million is almost double at $275,000 a bed. And that's only if you believe the one-page estimate Veneer came up with over a 3-day weekend in March. Nonetheless, appropriately or otherwise, the $75 million that is currently being drawn from this project represents less than 10% of that estimate. We think DBA's minimum standards are clear. Departments are responsible for ensuring they have sufficient appropriation and funding for the capital improvement project prior to the solicitation of bids. We also think Arkansas law is clear. For projects of this state or any agency of this state, amount appropriated means funds currently available for the project prior to the opening of any bids. Common sense should also prevail here. How is plowing ahead with a project that lacks any guarantee of funding and spending $75 million on paperwork anything more than an attempt to box the legislature into a corner? We believe the intent here is clear because we've heard the argument before. Back in December of last year, Senator Gilmore told us in reference to the mere $3 million the state had already spent on the property that officials needed to be good stewards of taxpayer money, and there is a very slim likelihood that we would look at any other land. Ostensibly indicating that once money is spent on a project, that the project must move forward. Continuing with that logic is not difficult, but it becomes all the more pressing and pressure-inducing when it's $75 million at stake instead of just $3 million, which the residents of Franklin County had offered to buy back the land. Pressure cooker aside, spending $75 million on an unfunded project puts us precariously close to repeating a mistake that South Dakota just made. After dumping more than $54 million into the project, South Dakota scrapped plans for their new 1,500-bed, $825 million prison, strangely, half the number of beds we expect at the same amount to get us. South Dakota pivoted to a more inclusive and transparent process that prioritized community acceptance, logistical feasibility, and fiscal responsibility in selecting a more appropriate site for their project. While, of course, we would like to see Arkansas do the same, the taxpayers would certainly like to see the state have the forethought to do so before we're $75 million in the hole. Overspending is overspending, but we think it's especially egregious when there has been so much disinformation spread about the true budget for this project. In a span of just 4 days this past spring, the project cost ballooned to almost double what the executive branch had been selling the public and the legislature for almost 2 years. Not only did the $470 million prove to be false, but DBA had explicitly told the governor's office in writing as early as December of 23 that budget would not deliver 3,000 beds. Perhaps even more troubling, Senator Hester noted that the cost for a 3,000 bed would be $750 million in 2022, before Governor Sanders even took office.
What numbers are we talking about when we say we need those 1,000 beds so we can alleviate the responsibility from our local sheriff's departments?
Well, I think the Department of Corrections is saying maybe 1,000 beds. I think that the information that I'm getting is saying we might need up to 3,000 or 3,500 beds. But a 3,000 bed prison would cost us about $750 million.
Coupled with the fact that WDD's initial program study returned an estimated cost of $1.2 billion in late summer of 2023, we don't believe there's any possibility that the $470 million was ever a reasonable budget for this project, especially not as the selected site. Conveniently, when instructed to go back to the drawing board, WDD was somehow able to shave $730 million off the estimate to match the governor's announcement. So it's no surprise that we're again shaving down the design to match the alleged budget instead of constructing the most appropriate type of facility for the state's needs. This is all exceedingly troublesome, given that the governor's initial letter to the JBC requested only a $330 million appropriation, which, like the current $75 million, would leave the project woefully short of full funding. Meaning the legislature and the public were sold a budget the state should have well known was insufficient until the legislature balked. Then the estimate raised by 76% in 4 days. The pattern seems clear. Under budget to secure funding in order to force the legislature's hand when it comes to approval of the remaining funds that will actually be needed to finish this project. With Senator Hester's $750 million estimate, the $1.2 billion estimate from WDD, DBA's insistence that $470 million wouldn't cut it, and the widespread speculation that this is really a $1.5 billion project, this behavior causes grave concerns that we would remain in this cycle of underfunding leading to manufactured legislative pressure, even had the legislature approved the governor's appropriation request in session. Again, overspending is overspending, regardless of the amount, and it's bad enough for the state in its own right. But what really deserves examination here is the process. If we have an executive engaging in a concerted effort to strong-arm the legislature into funding capital projects, the veracity of and motive behind every statement from the executive in connection with such a project should be called into question and carefully examined. And to our complaint, that starts with the funds already expended prior to legislative approval. Here are some questions relevant to this section, and before I pass it to Adam for the last section of our presentation, this is a reminder that if you want to take a break, this would be the halfway point.
All right, section 4, and it's dense. We try to do our best with keeping visuals on the screen for y'all to follow along, but apologies in advance. So failing to conduct property diligence on real property prior to its purchase is irresponsible and improper. So I want to start by acknowledging that, yes, we've seen the 47-page site assessment prepared by GIS and offered as Exhibit D2 to this hearing. We've also presented it as Complainant's Exhibit A, and that's how we're referring to it in our presentation, just for clarity. We contend that the information we're presenting to you in this section clearly indicates that pulling data on a parcel of real property does not constitute the extent of pre-purchase due diligence required as stewards of taxpayer dollars to determine whether such parcel is feasible for any particular project, especially not for the second most costly capital improvement project in state history. If it did, we wouldn't be sitting here today with some of the most basic, fundamental questions about this project unanswered. Worse yet, not only was proper due diligence not conducted, but the state's internally created and ever-shifting criteria were ultimately watered down to the point that they might as well have been abandoned altogether in the final site selection. So let's start by looking a little bit at that criteria. First and foremost, the state's criteria for the prison was a moving target throughout the search process. So we're going to walk through those and chart them before we get into the specifics of the Franklin County site and how it matches up. The earliest version of the criteria we can find, and therefore the most inconsistent with the state's ultimate site selection, is back to Mr. Porfiri's testimony in front of ALC on November 17th, 2023.
With respect to the prison construction and those 3,000 beds, Arkansas history of prison construction has been through the use of donated land. Often donated land within the state of Arkansas to build prisons is not at a premium. It costs a lot to improve that land to make it suitable for an infrastructure to go on top of it. Additionally, it's not in the most right location to allow for a workforce that can immediately staff that prison, as well as a sustainable workforce that can maintain the facility over the long haul as far as having appropriate staffing levels. So I'm deviating from that past behavior as the status quo I do not believe has served the state of Arkansas well with regards to the locations of prisons in the state of Arkansas. I have specific criteria associated with where that prison should be constructed, and it has to do with, like I said, a sustainable workforce. It's got to be within a certain proximity to a level 3 trauma center. I have to ensure quality of work life for those employees that work at that facility, which means that the commute has to be reasonable from their homes and that it has to be close to highways, and the land has to be suitable for construction of such a facility. In addition, community has to embrace the fact that a prison would go into their community or near their community. So all those factors will be associated and written into the procurement action that the vendor who proposes to build the facility will have to inform us of the location and community buy-in with regards to where the prison will be located. That process is underway. We're hoping to issue an RFP sometime in the beginning of the new year.
So we'll go ahead and chart those out. And next, we have criteria outlined in December of 2023 by Director Laidlaw with additions from Mr. Cooper with DOC. Those will be on the chart, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on the email. We'll put them on there. The next set comes from a DBA presentation in January of 2024, which largely mirrors Mr. Cooper's list from December, with the addition of a county population requirement and a workforce formula provided by a consulting workforce expert. Put those on the chart. Next, which this is the last version documented prior to the site purchase. In March of 2024, we see another DBA presentation that changes the approach a bit. Rather than laying out specific criteria, it notes that, quote, sites are evaluated according to how they meet criteria overall, rather than any single factor alone. We'll put that on the chart. And lastly, we see the primary search criteria accompanying the DOC site assessment that Director Johnson emailed to the BOC just the evening before their vote to accept the Franklin County property. These criteria notably omit any specific information, instead opting for language such as, quote, availability of primary infrastructure and, quote, proximity to emergency services. But we'll go ahead and chart out what we can. So let's briefly ignore which criteria the Franklin County property does and doesn't meet and just look at the moving goalposts. The Franklin County property was first identified via an online listing by GIS on July 3rd, 2024. For the 20 months prior, real, tangible, and quantifiable criteria existed for the location of the proposed prison. As you can see by this comparison, not only did the final post-purchase, quote, criteria become so amorphous that just about any large tract of land would have sufficed, but critical elements such as distance to an interstate, cost of infrastructure improvements, and most importantly, community acceptance were completely omitted. Now, Secretary Wallace maintains that the state did everything it was able to prior to purchasing the property.
What I do understand to be factual is that everything that we could do before we purchased the land was done in terms of checking things out.
However, nothing in the purchase agreement for the property prohibits any study the state would have wished to conduct during the due diligence period. They even went so far as to extend the standard 90-day due diligence period through the day before closing. Secretary Wallace's position is proven false by the state's own actions in beginning to conduct the very studies it should have and could have conducted before purchase 6 months after the fact. And our point is essentially proven by this admission that reports being delivered on June 25th, 2025, almost 8 months after the close of the due diligence period, constitute, quote, necessary due diligence. The bottom line here is this. Watering down your site criteria to fit the parcel of land that you want to purchase is the opposite of due diligence. It's setting the DOC up for failure. And that's before we even address the shortcomings of the Franklin County property when compared to the final site criteria, which we'll start going through now. So out of these 6 different versions of property criteria over a year-plus period, let's try to walk through these with the focus on the versions of the criteria that are both quantifiable and make the most realistic sense as they relate to the needs of an adequate site for a mega prison. We'll check off the first 2 in the state's favor. We don't need to waste time here. It's not within 60 miles of an existing DOC facility, and it's not in a floodplain. So the next is urban versus rural. While the site is not within city limits, which meets Director Laidlaw's early draft criteria, we would tend to agree with the DBA presentation from March 1st, 2024, that many rural locations, including this one, are completely ruled out, both based on lack of infrastructure, which we'll cover in more detail down the list. As further support for that opinion, we would refer to the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission's report, recent recommendations that TDCJ develop a plan to close its rural facilities that can't be staffed. So for us, this category gets an X. Workforce, and this one is dense, there's some math, so apologies again. We think each of the criteria laid out in this category is pretty important, but we're going to start with an easy one. A county with 30,000 plus population. Franklin County has 17,097 people, so that crosses that off the list. Next, and probably more important, is a location that's immediately and sustainably staffable, taking into account the quality of work-life balance to employees. So let's take a look at the workforce formula that Director Johnson received in response to his reaching out to a workforce expert with questions about how to evaluate potential sites. That formula is explained on screen, but we have to modify a couple things to fit this site. First, the expert here is relying on manufacturing as the recruiting base for her 20% participation rate. So we need to adjust that to fit this project. The Bureau of Labor Statistics lists correctional officers and jailers as accounting for 0.2% of the workforce, and all protective service occupations as 2.2%. If we're exceedingly generous, disregard the lower participation security positions, and anticipate that our current environment doubles actual labor participation in the entire industry, we can just round up and use a 5% participation rate. Then, to compare apples to apples, we need to remove the expert's 50% reduction in population to calculate labor force, because the state's comparison numbers are already to total labor force as opposed to total population. So what that means is the total labor force needed is the number of positions to be filled times the number of candidates you need per position divided by the participation rate in the industry. The appropriate formula for evaluating the site per the state's expert can be noted mathematically as you see on the screen. So when we plug in the variables that we know to staff this prison and look at the expert's criteria, her optimum scenario allows for 50 candidates per position looking to be filled. When you run the math, that gives us a required labor force of 800,000. Her minimally acceptable scenario is 25 candidates per position. That returns a needed labor force of 400,000. The entire labor force in the entire 5-county area surrounding the Franklin County site is 108,784. Based on the state's own site assessment, the labor force is short over 291,000 workers for the expert's minimally acceptable criteria. And that would be far worse if we were looking at just the 30-mile drive shed. Where the math gets even more telling is scoring the reality of the site's regional labor force against the expert's scoring scale. For this, we have to do a little bit of algebra and change the equation to solve for candidates per position. We do that by multiplying our participation rate by the labor force available, then dividing by the number of positions needing to be filled. And mathematically, that looks like this. Again, when we plug in our known quantities, 6.79 candidates per position is our result. And if you check the expert scoring scale above, it only awards candidates scores down to 25 candidates per position. The site scores a 0 out of 10. Look, it took us a while to work out all that math, and apparently it was hard for Director Johnson too, which totally makes sense to us. Again, we dispute that GIS should have ever been doing this kind of evaluation in the first place, but it's clear that even when getting an expert's position on the site score, an expert's opinion that the site score is bottomed out for workforce, the state promptly ignored the data. All of that math doesn't even address the inherent conflict in the state's assessment data. On the left, we see a depiction of the 30-mile drive shed surrounding the site, reflecting a labor force of, which is 18-plus population, of 127,395, while the entire regional workforce map on the right shows a labor force of only 108,784. Because the entire drive shed falls within the region but doesn't encompass the entire region, it's plainly impossible for the drive shed to have a larger labor force than the region as a whole. Notably, though, even with the inflated figure listed on the drive shed map, the expert's formula still returns the same results. The site ranks a 0 out of 10. That's right there. And look, we've already heard the talk about reducing the number of beds at this facility from 3,000 to 1,000 to save face. So for clarity, the math still results in a 0 out of 10. These are the kinds of massive shortcomings that neither a pay bump or a new bridge are going to solve. However you want to slice it, the workforce category gets an X for this location. So services has a lot of different categories on it, so we're going to walk through a couple of them, and we're not going to talk about landfills, but proximity to a trauma center, distance from a hospital, those things are important for a prison. So hospitals. As the site assessment shows, the site is indeed 19 miles to the nearest hospital, which is just within the 25-mile criteria. It also correctly reflects that the closest level 3 trauma center is Mercy Fort Smith, which clocks in at 27 miles, or a 38-minute drive. We can't definitively say whether that fits into Mr. Porfiri's criteria of, quote, within a certain proximity, but it sure seems prudent to us to be closer than the better part of an hour drive from a trauma center when you're running a prison. Here, the site assessment clearly has the data, so we don't know and can't say whether the state considered it just good enough or didn't consider it at all. Fire departments. This is an area where a GIS assessment just doesn't present the full story of the reality of the site. What's left off of the fire department's name on this map, other than by acronym, is that each and every one of these are volunteer staffed, and all but one is specifically designated as a rural fire department. What that means is that they're mostly intended for hay baler and brush fires, and they look like this. This is the nearest one to the site. And look, we're not disparaging our firefighters. We love them. But neither of the two gentlemen that work at this facility are going to put a dent in a prison fire. All of that routing analysis also omits that all of these fire stations would be solely reliant on transported water, given that the nearest fire hydrant is 6.8 miles away, and that is a lot of hose to unroll. Law enforcement. So this is one of those that I don't have documentation to back it up, so you're welcome to take my word for it or ignore me. But one of the points specifically consistently brought up by our community is that Charleston is a quiet, peaceful town. Even its motto is where serenity prevails. And we don't have police patrols in the city past midnight. More importantly and quantifiably, for both county and local law enforcement services, the state admitted in the town hall that the prison will cannibalize local law enforcement for at least several years before it levels out.
One of the more central uses of Bill Calvin law, real similar to what we have here in Charleston in the rural community, and it did not affect the local law enforcement that significantly, say, after a couple of years. When it first opened, yes, but after several years it has not. It doesn't get affected today.
The site is also on the wrong side of the river from the sheriff's office. Bottom line, between distances, law enforcement cannibalization by the prison, and an already existing critical workforce issues that we just discussed, your response times are going to be less than ideal, to say the least. All in all, it doesn't appear that any single one of these categories sufficiently meets the desired criteria, and certainly when taken as a whole, the property fails the test of the services criteria category, and we're giving it an X. Interstate access. So what you're seeing on the screen is a video of the drive from the nearest interstate exit, which is I-40 in Ozark, to the proposed site. This video is at 10 times speed. You won't see a shoulder, a passing lane, or a pit stop past Ozark for that whole video. While you watch that, let's take a look at the criteria. Pretty uniformly, easy access to I-40 is noted, and that's further quantified as within 2 miles of the interstate. This site is 23.3 miles from that exit at its nearest point. That means for any potential employee using I-40 to commute to a job here, that's a 34-minute drive after they exit the interstate. It doesn't exactly factor in well to that work-life balance that Mr. Porfiry discussed back in 2023. Let's see how far we are. So we're not even halfway there yet. And remember, this is 10 times speed. So anecdotes aside, the site is over 10 times the distance desired from the interstate and clearly fails this category. We'll add an X when we get there, I guess. We don't have to watch the whole thing, but it's beautiful country. This is what I couldn't show you in the beginning. In the middle of the video, it's the map showing 34 minutes and 23.3 miles from the interstate. We're going to give that an X, I think, pretty clearly. Infrastructure is the next category on our criteria list. And the first of that is wastewater. So on-site wastewater treatment facilities are nothing new to prisons in this state. However, no evaluation has been made for the cost escalation for the construction of a treatment facility versus a site with public sewer available. Likewise, no pre-purchase considerations were made for the potential environmental impact for neighboring properties Onion Creek flows through and their potential exposure to the prison's discharge, which the site assessment at least puts a number on at 127 properties. Moreover, despite warnings that Clean Water Act issues were identified on the property, the state failed to conduct a 404 Wetland Act designation evaluation until 6 months after it purchased the property. And we've seen no evidence of even a plan to conduct an environmental impact study. So despite, quote, wastewater treatment feasible being one of the few items included in the final search criteria, the official site assessment omits any relevant information about such feasibility. Electricity. 8 to 10,000 amps is a massive amount of power, which makes sense. 3,800 people on the side of a mountain is effectively a bigger city than exists in any direction for miles around. Similarly, the state site assessment fails to meaningfully address this category, possibly because the final search criteria doesn't list 8 to 10,000 amps with 2 sources, it simply lists electricity available. What the site assessment does show is that there are not 2 sources available. There's 1 transmission line owned by OG&E and services provided by Arkansas Valley Electric. It also notes that residential service is specified, meaning that this isn't dual or 3-phase power running through beefed up and backed up substations. This is rural residential basic power. What it does reflect is the depiction of a high voltage line bisecting the property. Thankfully, somebody at the state has realized that they can't build under those lines and has inquired with OG&E about simply moving them. I guess that's an easy thing to do, I'm not sure. But this wasn't until 3 months after the purchase, and it comes at an unknown cost, even though these easements were readily available and constitute title encumbrances that are a basic facet of any pre-closing title commitment review process. Roads. Curiously, we don't see road criteria referenced outside of kind of cursory references to needing paved highways, but we're including it here, 1, because it's included on the site assessment, and 2, because it's something that's critical to consider for any massive scale construction project, which ultimately will have hundreds of entries and exits every single day. In the site assessment, we see a few of the highways in the area, along with average daily traffic counts as of 2019. So 5-year-old data seems a bit outdated to us, but since this really isn't telling us anything other than existing traffic counts, I'm not sure that really matters much. What's much more important than current traffic counts are future anticipated ones, coupled with both the quality and integrity of the highways and potential need for improvement. Though on March 20th, 2025, we heard Mr. Porphyry testify in front of the Joint Budget Committee that, quote, "The roadways there are no different than the roadways anywhere in the state."
Roadways, my understanding of roadways are the roadways there are no different than the roadways anywhere in the state. They're built to a specific standard, and there's no issue associated with whatever load that is going to be necessary to construct this facility with those roadways. Those roadways are no different than any roadway to any facility that we currently have in the state of Arkansas.
Rather coincidentally, at the very same time Mr. Porphyry was testifying, RDOT was drafting an email regarding the major upgrades needed to the roadways prior to construction and its associated traffic. And they note a minimum cost of $500,000 a mile for those improvements. Clearly, all roads in Arkansas are not the same. And clearly, judging from the conflicting information given 5 months after purchasing the property, the state did not fully evaluate the roads, or the anticipated impact on the roads, or the cost implications of needing improvements to them. Subtopically to roads, bridges are one of the most glaring examples of why simply pulling map data does not constitute proper due diligence. On the site assessment, you see a total of 2 weight-restricted posted bridges mapped and no other bridges in the area. And that's 100% accurate, straight from RDOT's records. However, what you don't see is that RDOT defines a bridge and therefore only maintains records on, quote, bridges that are over 20 feet in length. Now, because RDOT doesn't maintain the data, we found it for ourselves. Again, we'd love for you to take our words for it, but if you want to come out and count, we'll follow along with you. Based on our counts, there are 259 either short bridges or culverts less than 20 feet along the highways depicted in this map. And they have no RDOT records or inspections associated for public access. If I were a betting man, I'd wager that our county judge has some thoughts on the quantity and size of loads that are going to be traversing these crossings. So to the elephant in the room, water. Look, I think everybody here has read the news and the reports on water, so we're not going to belabor the point, but we do want to make sure we're briefly all on the same page. The state site assessment merely includes a water line map, and for reasons that are unclear to us, some pictures of area water towers, which would be insufficient to service the prison for even a single day. Again, relying on map data and a barely cursory email from ADH showing 3 million gallons of excess capacity in Ozark's water system, the state checked the minuscule criteria of, quote, water available off of its list. I don't think I need to explain in great detail that you can have 1 billion gallons of excess capacity. If you don't have access to the ability to treat or a mechanism to deliver 1 billion gallons, you might as well have nothing. So here we sit. Fort Smith is a no-go. We all know the $50,000 test wells didn't pan out, which state water experts find even the prospect of doubtful. The well experts say deeper isn't better, and there hasn't even been chatter of a hydrogeologic study to protect the scant water that the neighbors actually can access. And no one's even bothered to call Ozark, who, by the way, has publicly stated that they can't do it and don't support it. Folks, our neighbors have been screaming at the tops of their lungs that there's no water on that mountain since they first heard the governor's announcement over KDYN's airwaves last Halloween. Even if, by some miracle, the water situation were to sort itself out tomorrow, the current set of circumstances bears out the heart of this complaint. The state did not do its homework. This is even more telling as the amount of water needed is a known quantity, and there's no lack of $57 million design contract to hide behind, or at least there shouldn't be. And if the murmurs we're hearing are true, it boggles our minds that the remedy sought by our conservative state government for its own lack of due diligence could be turning to federal welfare for a bailout. The site fails this criteria categorically, and objectively cannot be the best place in the state to attempt to build this facility. So it gets an X. Okay, those were a couple dense ones. So the next are more straightforward, and apologies for getting into the weeds, but I think it was necessary on a couple of those points. So size and topography is next. For size, over somewhere between 76 and 300 acres. Check, that's easy. Topography, relatively flat, which, I don't know, seems important when you're building something that folks like to try to escape. If anyone knows anything about contour lines and maps, that's not flat, relatively or otherwise. So I guess since these are kind of combined criteria, we'll do a check and an X and give it a half point. Locale, super easy here, don't even have a slide for you. Franklin County is not any of those preferred locations, so that's an X. Soil reports. So this item is listed on as critical, a critical criteria, and has information pulled from USDA data on the site assessment. However, just a little bit of experience with industrial real estate informs our assumption that the intent and useful preliminary report here is a geotechnical report. Again, a true feasibility study would have revealed this and conducted the appropriate test immediately, as evidenced by the fact that the state did eventually conduct this testing 6 months after it purchased the property. While the official preliminary geotechnical is itself preliminary, and its introduction notes that a final geotechnical investigation and report should be conducted, Veneer's cover letter does note that, quote, some mitigation measures are expected and will have cost implications. So here again, the documents prove our point. Stopping the site search and purchasing a property without full investigation escalates cost. And without evaluating this site against more appropriate ones, the state will never know how much more it has to spend simply by virtue of its poor site selection. So for us, this gets an X, but we understand it's kind of amorphous and we made an assumption, so we're going to be just lenient and give it a check. Community acceptance. So if you've been following the list, which I know is tough with how much we're covering, you've already noticed we skipped one. Really, we just went out of order because he wants to end with soil studies, I guess. Look, in no uncertain terms, Mr. Porfiry testifies to ALC that community acceptance is a must for this type of facility.
In addition, community has to embrace the fact that a prison would go into their community or near their community. So all those factors will be associated and written into the procurement action that the vendor who proposes to build the facility will have to inform us of the location and community buy-in with regards to where the prison will be located.
Then it's never spoken of again. Just a few weeks ago, our Senate President Pro Tem gave an interview where he stated that not only is the reality that a majority of the people in our community accepting and supportive of this prison, but that the ones who aren't want to see violent criminals walking our streets.
A majority of the people in that area are for this prison. There are a few that oppose it. Look, there's always a few people, they oppose prisons. They want violent criminals walking the street.
Ladies and gentlemen, my community has absolutely been put through the ringer with the level of dismissal, disrespect, and denigration shown to it by the state throughout this process, and I cannot emphasize enough how patently false that statement is. The best evidence I can give to you of this is the fact that city councils for every municipality surrounding the Franklin County site and the Franklin County Quorum Court have signed resolutions opposing this project. And this is what the streets in our small towns have looked like since last November. In small towns and rural communities in Arkansas, we still understand that the best way to gather information or opinions on something is just to get folks in the same room and have a conversation with them. Instead, the state chose to cut us out of the process and ignore this vital requirement to the project's success. In case you haven't had a look behind me, a few of our friends and neighbors have joined us for this hearing. So if you have any doubts whatsoever about the level of community acceptance for this project, each and every one of them would be more than happy to discuss it with you offline at any time. For us, this gets the biggest X out of all of these. So we're done with going through those. We can score it. That comes out to 4.5, generously, of the 12 categories that this site satisfies, and none of the critical categories. That doesn't paint a pretty picture, especially if we're concerned, as Mr. Porphyry was, about the sheer increase in cost and time required to force this poorly selected site. So poorly selected that even Director Laidlaw twice emailed colleagues noting that the site was not viable just days before Director Johnson's email that site selection was complete. So, if you find any assertion that the state conducted proper due diligence is true, then it must follow that they have consistently ignored the facts that any such due diligence uncovered. While we can't make assumptions about their motivations, we can review the facts of the matter, and the facts clearly demonstrate that despite the rampant insistence to the contrary, this site is by no means the best site in the state for a new prison. It's less than ill-equipped for a prison facility, and it presents a myriad of out-of-the-ordinary barriers to building a new, large-scale prison. The state is arguing that somehow it doesn't know what the design for the project is, and that it cannot determine answers to feasibility-related questions until this legislature approves a $57 million design contract. But it does know that this is the best property in the state for that project. These are plainly mutually exclusive ideas. And Mr. Porphyry said as much back in 2023, when the plan was to go about this project the proper way and bring in a design professional before site selection to secure community acceptance. In contrast, this project has been done backward from the start. The state selected the site, then hired an owner's rep, and now seeks legislative approval to spend $57 million to retroactively rubber stamp its bad decisions. At the end of the day, the work the state did just doesn't meet the high bar of due diligence. The information it gathered doesn't indicate site suitability for the project, and nothing done to date constitutes a feasibility study. Spending nearly $3 million of taxpayer monies without checking these boxes is a misuse of taxpayer funds. Alleging that we need to spend $57 million more to check these boxes is reckless. And the consequence is more than wasted dollars. It's the loss of credibility, time, and trust at the very moment when these same state leaders claim they were doing all of this to solve a pressing crisis. So, for the last time, there's a couple questions on your screen that we think are relevant to this section of the complaint. That's all I have for this section, but before I pass it back to Natalie for just a couple closing comments, just for me, I'd like to thank the chairs and the committee again for your time and attention, and the opportunity to be here and present all this to you today.
Push your microphone, please.
Thank you. Is that better? Okay. I hope what we've shown you here today solidifies the fact that we aren't here as obstructionists in the way of progress. We aren't bringing you purely NIMBY arguments because we're upset about having our way of life fundamentally altered. And we certainly aren't here because we somehow want to see dangerous criminals walking the streets. We're here because any process that leaves a government in this kind of direct and consistent conflict with its citizens, some of its most supportive citizens, no less, deserves to be examined and corrected for future iterations. From our perspective, this project has been the perfect storm of lack of transparency, executive overreach, incompetence, and dishonesty. We believe we've shown you ample evidence of all of 4 categories of behavior in today's presentation. While we were preparing for today's hearing, in a moment of sheer exasperation at the monumental task of condensing our research into a reasonable presentation, I commented to Adam that we could have another month to prepare and a full day to present, and we still couldn't cover everything in this story. Similarly, A journalist who came and spent a week with us in Franklin County to cover the story remarked at the end of her trip that should one choose to do so, an investigative journalist could make an entire career out of just this project. What we've shown you today is a fraction of what we've uncovered, and all of this is just from some Google searches and FOIA requests. Arkansas deserves the full story. They deserve honesty, transparency, and accountability from their government. And if nothing else is clear today, what has become blindingly obvious over the last year is that they aren't going to get any of that without your help. We both know this was a lot of information, so we want to again thank you for conducting this hearing and for your time and willingness to listen. We're happy to take any questions you might have either now or at any point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take questions today as time. Thank you. If y'all will, again, I understand the passion. I understand good presentation, but we'll refrain from those things. I will take questions from committee and non-committee members. We will also monitor time and try to be as fair with that as we can. So first up, Senator King, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to let you know that the water I provided there on the table for you to make sure I know what these long presentations can be in the water. I just want everybody to know that Brian King is on record as providing more drinking water there than they found at the Franklin County site for 3,800 people. So, you know, Senator Stubblefield and I had tons of conversations about this. We had a lot of conversations about cattle. You know, we talked about the water, you know, and people look at the NIMBY lie that has been out there that has continued to be told. You know, we looked at a cattle. If we were putting a 3,800 head feedlot out there, before we purchased the property, we would have done due diligence and made 1,000% sure that that was there, or at least, at the very least, purchase the property with contingency basis that you would find it. You know, you talked about 96. I mean, I've drove that several times. You know, what you didn't see in that video, folks, is there's grass growing up in that highway. I mean, there's literally the whole thing will have to be resurfaced. The other thing is, too, you know, with what Senator Hester's comments about you just want dangerous people. I've been in politics long enough. If you're right on the facts and the truth, the best thing your critics are going to do, go to it in politics same today, is lie about your position. Franklin County, all my counties passed jail taxes. They have made commitments to lock up better people. So I just am proud of you guys for, number one, doing more research than what Joe Porfiry did on trying to find the right site location and not dispel this thing of just being a NIMBY, and I don't want it in my area. So thank you very much for doing your presentation.
We're happy to hear you be here, and thank you for listening to it.
Representative Bryan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At some point in your presentation towards the beginning, you made some statements about the $75 million that was appropriated for the Calico Rock expansion back in 2022, and then you followed up with, I think the quote was, funds were expended prior to legislative approval, or otherwise kind of insinuated there was some misspending of that money. My understanding was that Act 151 of 2023, that money was reappropriated back to Department of Corrections for capital improvement projects. So are you saying that law did not reappropriate that money back, or I don't understand the...
No, I think what we're mainly saying is that spending $75 million on a project where the budget is $825 million is inappropriate. I just thought it was notable that that money was initially specifically appropriated for prison expansion, not new prison construction.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. But it'd be fair to say that the money was reappropriated after there was the fight on prison expansion. Is that not correct?
Sure.
Specifically, I think I recall that the governor's office wanted to go ahead and expand some of the beds at prisons we have, and the Department of Corrections pretty much shot that down and then got into a lawsuit. And at that point, it was then proposed to build a new prison. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that depends on your thoughts on what the best solution for the problem that we're having is, which, we're not really here to address today, but the way it's been handled for this specific project, we're alleging is inappropriate.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. But isn't that exactly what we're here today, is to solve this problem? I mean, at the end of your presentation, you made a statement, one of y'all made a statement, something to the effect of like this supposed crisis. I mean, are we not in a crisis when it comes to our prisons in this state? I served on a quorum court before I came to the legislature, and we couldn't put people in our county jail for misdemeanors because it was full of state inmates. We now have state inmates that are getting released under EPA. I mean, these are, I'm sorry, but they really are violent criminals. In fact, to get ready for today's hearing, I went and looked at the EPA reports for 2022, and they last had to do a round of releases, and I picked a name at random. I just literally picked a name at random out of the list, and it was a guy that had been arrested and sentenced to 20 years for raping a 15-year-old, and he was out in like 3.5 years under EPA. I think we do have a crisis, and we got to do something about it. I mean, is that not the purpose that we're here today? Whether it's building a new prison here, there, or somewhere else, we got to have space for these people.
I think the purpose of this committee is to address the complaint that we filed and the crisis, the decades of underfunding that's led to the crisis, all of the situations surrounding that aren't really at play today. What's at play today is the improper way the state has gone about this specific capital improvement.
Senator Dismang, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, to that, because I've been a little bit curious myself, I mean, and it may be specifically directed towards you or the other chairman or whoever, about what are we looking at for an outcome today? I mean, is there some action that you think that we're going to be taking, or, but because they clearly believe there should be an action taken, that was what was just stated. What is the perception of the leadership of the committee?
I will give you my perception as the chair of JPR, and my co-chair and I both agreed to have the meeting. One was we don't have meetings for every citizen request. Not every citizen's request has this many people involved. Not every citizen request has had this much media. Not every citizen request it probably has had as much factual information, and it may cut both ways. I'm trying to do the responsibility of the chair. As for the outcome, my reason for having this committee is for transparency. That's been stated, and I hope that is also felt the same way from the state's point of view, because again, they have their own packet and they'll be able to speak too. But it's to give an air of transparency and an air that this thing can be covered in a fair way. As far as whether it'll change anything, I don't have a predetermined mindset. I'll let my co-chair speak if you'd like to.
Senator Dismain, I agree wholly with what Senator Rice said. I know we have to eventually sometimes let our citizens groups, when it's such a large item and such a big request, to come and present. What comes out of this meeting is up to the group that sits behind them over here. You know, if we want to carry this any further, that would go through here. Or if they want to carry it any further, they'll go to where they have to. But I think we're hearing it. Let you guys hear it, make your decisions if you want to do anything about it or not. That would be mine.
So, I mean, just to be clear, I'm great with the transparency and great with the discussion. I mean, is there expectation that there's going to be some kind of vote for some type of action, or you're both saying that that is to be determined? Because I'm just trying to understand what my role is as a committee member for what it is we're doing, aside from listening, which I am very happy to do.
I mean, if some of the committee wants to make a motion to vote on something's fine. What my goal is here today is take this and determine if there's more information needing. Again, it's been stated, and I think the other side finally came to maybe the term of investigation is not the same as it is for some terms of investigation. We have our limitations, but there are things within state government we can check on. If we feel like there's something needs to be done, we can do that. If not, we'll determine by taking in the information today and decide if we want to discuss any more. Hope that answers your question. I do not see anyone else on the board for these If not, thank you for your presentation, and we'll move on with the agenda.